If you look around the world, you'll see that news is a very important part of lives of ordinary people in almost every society. It's true that news is a central part of political and cultural life in the USA, it's true in China, it's true here in Russia. I think, however, there is growing evidence that the position of news is slipping in society. Today I'm going to start by talking about the situation with newspapers, which is only one form of news, but I'm going to try and generalize from that to say that overall there are problems for news and its place in our society, and that these problems have big implications. The newspaper is a good place to start because the symptoms of the crisis are very evident there. There are, in fact, two dimensions to this crisis. One, a relatively simple dimension, is economic. If one looks at the USA, one sees that over the last decade or so, roughly 30% of journalists have lost their jobs, retired and not been replaced or whatever. The number of journalists is declining, the wages of journalists are falling and so on. There's a good and simple reason for this, which is that US newspapers are experiencing financial difficulties. The financial difficulties are primarily to do with the collapse of the newspaper advertising market. In the year 2000, the US newspaper, on average, got about 85% of its revenue from advertising. Over the last 15 years, that revenue has vanished, well, not vanished completely, but fallen by about half. It's fallen because advertising has moved to a more efficient place. It's moved essentially online. It's more efficient for an advertiser to place their money and their advertisement with Google or another online service than in the New York Times or the Washington Post or wherever else. And newspapers in the US have experienced a significant financial restriction, which is why the number of journalists have fallen, which is why the situation of newspapers is increasingly problematic. Not minor, but simple problem to understand. A much more general and difficult problem to understand is that since the mid-1980s, the absolute number of people in the US reading newspapers has steadily declined without interruption. And this decline is particularly acute amongst young people. People under the age of 34 in the USA are increasingly unlikely to read newspapers. Now, this is the United States of America, which is a big and important country, but it's not the only country in the world. However, I could point to similar crises, similar problems in Western Europe and, surprisingly enough, in China. What has been conventional wisdom for the last 10 years or so is that while newspapers are declining in their traditional markets in the West, they are growing in places like India and China. This is still true for India. It's still true for many developing countries. But it's no longer true for China. As China has become more developed, as the internet has been spread more widely in China, so we get the beginnings of a similar problem to the USA. So the question which confronts us is, why do young people no longer want to read newspapers? I think that one answer that people give is that they now get their news online. And this is of course true. Young people go online much more regularly, increasingly from mobile apps and so on. However, this is a different form of news consumption than that provided by the traditional newspaper, or for that matter, by the traditional television program. If you look at the most followed figures on Twitter, only one of them, Barack Obama, is the kind of figure who is traditionally associated with the front page of the New York Times, or the front page of the Guardian for that matter. The normal kind of figure, the other 9, are people like Justin Bieber, Lady Gaga, Taylor Swift, popular entertainers essentially. However, what is happening online is not that people are looking at Taylor Swift or whoever and at other traditional news subjects, but instead of. And you can see that again clearly if you look at the top 10 Google searches for the year 2015. Of the top 10 Google searches, 2 fit the model of classical news stories, both essentially the same thing, Charlie Hebdo and Paris. These are both references to the terrorist attack in Paris, and those are clearly part of the traditional news agenda of any medium. However, the other 8 are again popular entertainers. In the case of Google searches, mostly the stars of a television series called The Kardashians, which I'm told is as popular in Moscow as it is in New York or London. So what we have is evidence that yes, young people go online, yes, young people find news online, but the kind of news that they look for, the kind of news that they're consuming, tends to be different from the kind of news you would find in the New York Times, the kind of news you would find in The Guardian, or the kind of news that you would find in most Russian newspapers for that matter. What this suggests to me is that there is a general problem with news. It's not simply an economic problem of the newspaper. If you look at television news, it's true that there are 24-hour news channels, but these have very, very small audiences. In Britain, the most successful channel, BBC 24, it's a news channel, has 1% audience share. CNN in Britain has an audience share so small it cannot be measured. It's less than 0.1% of the audience. I would guess that that's true here in Russia as well, that CNN has an audience, but it's a very small audience. The fact that it's such a small audience doesn't mean that it's unimportant. That audience is going to be businessmen, politicians, diplomats, civil servants, and so on. They're important people, but there aren't very many of them. People like you and me are not, in general, watching 24-hour news. The evidence seems to suggest that overall there is a crisis of news. This immediately raises the question as to why there should be such a crisis. And in order to answer that question, we have to try and establish why, in the first place, people in 1990 or 1980 were able and willing to read large quantities of newspapers, watch television programs with news content, and so on. There is no well-established answer to this. Clearly, a number of factors contribute to news consumption. First is that news consumption tends to be disproportionately an urban phenomenon, so that as countries like China and India today, Russia 50 years ago, Britain 150 years ago, went from being largely rural peasant societies to being urban societies. So news became, and newspapers and later television and radio news became a part of people's everyday lives. Clearly, literacy, in the case of newspapers, is a major factor. Illiterates cannot, by definition, read newspapers. So the spread of literacy, which in Britain, I think, dates from 120, 130 years ago. In Russia, I would guess, dates from the 1920s or 1930s, but I don't know. In China, dates really from the establishment of the new China in 1949 and so on. The establishment of literacy is clearly a contributory factor. Reasonable disposable income is clearly also a contributory factor. The very poor need food and clothing and shelter and before they need newspapers. So I think these are factors which explain why in general there should be a newspaper readership, but they don't explain why there is at present such an acute crisis. And I think I would want to relate that to the changing nature of contemporary society. The newspaper, if you like, and news in general are arguably characteristic of modern society. And as we pass from modern to postmodern societies, so the place of news shifts. I think one of the characteristics of modern society, and this is true in a whole range of different political forms, it's true in the case of the American dream, it's true in the case of European social democracy, it's actually true also in the rhetoric, at least, of Stalinist Russia, the rhetoric of Mao's China, is that we're all in it together. That whatever the difficulties we face, whatever the inequalities we encounter, in one way or another, working together, things will get better. America will get better, Russia will get better, China will get better, or whatever. I think that inclusive rhetoric is increasingly hollow for people. that if you look at, let's say, the current American presidential election, if you look at the current referendum in Britain over membership of the European Community and so on, you'll see that many people no longer believe that inclusive rhetoric. There's a suspicion of elites, there's a sense that one doesn't belong in one's own country, there's a sense in which one's views and beliefs are ignored. Very often this finds a very reactionary expression in, for example, Donald Trump, anti-immigrant feeling, in racism in Britain and so on. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I'm saying it's a common phenomenon. And in that phenomenon, in that kind of society where people think that they no longer have a place in society, their views no longer matter in society, so knowing about society becomes less important. So participating in politics, knowing about political life, reading the news is no longer an essential part of being a citizen. Today, being interested in the news is, for most people, something of an eccentricity. Much more sensible to be interested in Taylor Swift. Much more sensible to be interested in football or ice hockey or whatever diversion that one is interested in, because these make much more sense to people in terms of their everyday lives. Politics is remote, politics is distant, politics is for the professional politician. Economics is for bankers, economics is for industrialists, economics and politics are not for me, they're not for us, they're not for ordinary people. And if they're not for us, they're not for people like us, why should we read about them? Much better, much more interesting to read about scandals, sensations, sport, sex or whatever. So I think that's what's the origin of the crisis of news. That society no longer is organised in such a way as to make the traditional diet of news, which for educated people like me and for many other educated people should be about how the society is run, about what the choices facing society are, about what the threats and dangers facing society are. That is no longer an everyday a matter of real concern. It's out with our concerns, out with our interests, out with our power to do anything about. And so I think that the appetite for news is dying, and with it, the news organisations are slowly but surely dying, except at the elite level, except at the level of the New York Times, except at the level of the Financial Times, except at the level of the subsidised news organisations like Russia Today. At that level, there is clearly an audience. Bankers still want to know what's happening to finance. Politicians still want to know what's happening to politics. Elite individuals want to know about the world they run and control. Their media survives. Our media, the kind of media which made us feel part of a world that we thought we had a stake in, are slowly dying. And they're dying because it's becoming clearer and clearer to more and more people that we don't have a stake in society. What we think doesn't matter, that we no longer control, or if we ever did, the way in which society is the direction in which society is moving.
Okay, transmedia storytelling is a new term, a new concept, but as a phenomenon, it's quite old. We could talk, for example, about 100 years ago, stories such as Alice in the Wonderland or The Wizard of Oz, Tarzan, are considered, pioneer kinds of stories related to transmedia storytelling. But the term, the concept of transmedia storytelling was coined by Professor Henry Jenkins from the US in 2003. So in this sense, it's quite new, and probably because of that, it's still wildly open. So it's more an elusive concept than an ultimate idea or definition of transmedia storytelling. Nevertheless, we can still trace some of the main characteristics of transmedia storytelling according to Henry Jenkins, who first conceptualized it. So we could think about transmedia storytelling involving, well, first of all, number one, multiple media platforms. So it's more than one medium. It's not just a book, it's not just a movie, it's not just a video game, but it's a kind of story that is spread out through several media platforms. For example, a TV series, a book, a comic book, a video game, etc. So the second aspect, very important, it is about the expansion of content, which means that the story is spread out across different media platforms in the sense that the story is expanded, the story is growing, and the story has new elements, new information, new content, and not the repetition. This is very crucial for understanding transmedia storytelling. So transmedia storytelling is not about the repetition of the content, but the expansion. So new and relevant content that is presented in different media platforms. And the third element, very important for understanding transmedia storytelling, is audience engagement. Well, engagement is a kind of buzzword nowadays, and there are several different understandings of engagement. But for us right now, we could think about at least two main aspects. One is interaction, and other is participation. So the audience can somehow be involved into the story. So with these three elements, we can think about transmedia storytelling as an integrated experience. So we have all these elements spread out to different platforms with the collaboration of the audience, but in an organized way, in an integrated way, not loosely displayed. So this is the main idea of transmedia storytelling. Transmedia storytelling is also interesting to mention that it is not just related to fictional stories, but also to non-fictional content. So for example, nowadays we have transmedia storytelling related to activism, related to politics, journalism, marketing, branding, not just entertainment. So this is interesting to highlight. And also we could talk about different kinds of transmedia stories or transmedia projects. So Robert Pratton, he suggests three different types of transmedia stories. The first one, probably the most common one, is called transmedia franchise. What does it mean? So a transmedia franchise is probably the idea that everybody has in mind about transmedia. So maybe the most famous example is The Matrix. So this project from 1999 with the trilogy of 3 movies, but also several other extensions related to the story world of The Matrix. So we have the films, but we also have the animated films, and we have comics, and then we have video games, computer games, etc. So what is the main characteristic of a franchise? So in a franchise, we have all these elements of the story spread through different media platforms, but they are somehow independent which means that, well, if you want, you can just watch one movie from the Matrix, and then you can enjoy, and then you can have, you know, a good time, and you will be satisfied with it. Maybe you would like to watch the 3 movies to have more in-depth understanding of the story, and then you will enjoy. But maybe you will never watch the movies, but you play the game, and this is okay. So the idea that all these different elements can function as an entry point, so a way that for people to be in touch, to start to be in touch with this story world, and once they are inside this story world, they can choose if they want to migrate and go throughout all the other extensions that are being offered to them. So this is the idea of transmedia franchise. The second is called portmanteau transmedia. So portmanteau, na French word, that would mean port, to carry, and manteau is a jacket. So a kind of suitcase that you could put things inside. So the idea of portmanteau is more in the sense that, well, we have different elements across different media platforms, but they are kind of dependent on each other for the audience to really understand what is going on, for the audience to really have a good experience. And the classic example of portmanteau transmedia is alternate reality game. So the alternate reality game, it is well known, I think, nowadays already, and it's a kind of game that has as its motto, "This is not a game," in the sense that it is a kind of puzzle solving or treasure hunt experience, in the sense that people will have to follow the clues and go from a website, for example, to receiving a phone call, and then going to a live event, or coming back to a blog online. So normally alternate reality games involve online and offline experiences, and for the audience to make sense of the story, they should go through all the elements in order to do so. So this is the idea of portmanteau transmedia. And the third is called complex transmedia experience, and it's basically a combination of the two other. So when we have the parts of the story that are franchise, in the sense that they can be experienced independently, but we also maybe have an alternate reality game involved in this story world. So a good example would be here Lost. So Lost, the TV series, everybody knows. Lost was built to be a transmedia story, and besides the TV series, it has several other elements. So we have games, we have several websites, and also we have an alternate reality game called The Lost Experience. So the combination of the franchise with the alternate reality game would give us what is called the complex transmedia experience. And maybe for us now to conclude, we could think about one of the main questions related to transmedia storytelling, which is, well, what for? Now, why do we need transmedia stories, or do we really need this kind of production? It is all about the money, involved in it? So these kinds of questions are relevant for us to stop and try to understand the value of this kind of experience. We could say that, well, first of all, of course, it is related to making money, can be. This is true. For example, if we are talking about all these Hollywood blockbusters related to transmedia, such as Avatar, for example, of course, the financial aspect, the profit, so the intention to make money out of it, it is involved. But we believe that that's not just this, and it's not just as simple as making money. Why? Because there are several other projects that are totally not related to making profit or are at all not related to having a big budget. So it's very interesting to also realize that for us to produce a transmedia project, we do not necessarily need all the resources that Hollywood has, for example. In this sense, we could have as examples all the activism projects being produced all over the world that normally are absolutely not for profit and do not have any kind of intention to make money out of it, but it normally has the intention to bring awareness for people about certain issues. We could say then that the point of transmedia storytelling is to offer a more meaningful experience for the audience, to offer an enriched experience in the sense that people that are interested in a certain story world and a certain issue can have the opportunity to go deeper and have more information, to go deeper and be able to know more about this story world that they like, that they are related to, and that somehow are significant for them. So the terms multimedia, cross-media, and transmedia storytelling are widely used all over the world, but still we have lots of confusion about what could differentiate them. And actually there are several occasions in which people are using them as synonyms, but they are not. So let's take a look into each one of them. So let's start with multimedia. First, we have the prefix multi, which is not difficult to understand, that it means many, several, numerous. And then we have the word media. Well, there are different understandings and definitions of media itself, but I work with one definition that I think that is relevant for us, which is from Lisa Gittelman, an historian from the US, and then she basically defines media as something that involves two dimensions. So the first dimension is the understanding of media as means of communication. So it involves the physicality of it, the material aspect of it. But then she talks about a second dimension, which is related to the social and cultural aspects that are directly involved with this means of communication. So media it's not just related to film, print media, mobile media, not just the physical means of communication, but it also involves all the relations around it, social and cultural relations around it. So, multimedia. So actually the term multimedia is kind of old. It comes from the 60s. So actually in 1966, the artist Bob Goldstein in the US, in Long Island, he produced a lighting show, which was a kind of combination of light and visuals together. And at that time, to describe his artistic production, he called it multimedia. But since the 1990s, we can have multimedia being used as something to describe when we have text, audio, and visual elements together. So this started, the main example of multimedia at that time, it was the CD-ROM, when we had a physical CD that we could put on our computer, and then we could read stories, watch videos, have the sound, have the pictures, have all these elements together. So actually nowadays with the internet, basically the majority of the websites that we access today, they are multimedia because they somehow have text, they have audio and visual elements put together and presented simultaneously. So this is the idea of multimedia. And cross-media is a more recent term that started in 1999 with Big Brother. So everybody knows the Big Brother nowadays. But Big Brother as a TV format, a reality TV format that started in the Netherlands in 1999, was the moment in which Paul Zazera presented this term to try to describe these elements related to having a TV show with the possibility for people to vote and decide who stays in the house, who leaves the house, and then we had all the print media with magazines, everybody talking about the show and the people inside the show, etc. So this was the context. And again, if we talk about the prefix, we have the prefix cross, which implies the idea of movement. And cross also implies the idea of intersection. So in the sense that different media platforms are somehow intersecting. But what is essential for us to understand, especially in relation to transmedia storytelling that we will talk soon, is that cross-media is a broader term that can embrace several different kinds of projects. But the main idea is that although we have in cross-media productions multiple media platforms involved, we have normally, in most of them, the repetition of content and not the expansion of content. So here we would be talking about adaptations, for example. So when we have a book and this book is transformed, is adapted to be a movie. So we have basically the same content, but they are being presented in two different media platforms. So this is the main idea of cross-media. And transmedia storytelling is much more narrowed, much more specific than cross-media, in the sense that Henry Jenkins, professor from the US, who coined the term transmedia storytelling in 2003, he defines as one of the key elements of transmedia storytelling the expansion of content. So exactly the opposite of cross-media, in the sense that when we have a transmedia story, we have the story being unfolded, being developed and growing across different media platforms. We do not have the repetition of the same content from the book in the movie, or the same content from the movie in the video game, and things like that. So this is probably the main difference between transmedia storytelling and cross-media. So transmedia involves the prefix trans, which means transcendence, which is related to the idea of going beyond. No? So a transmedia story goes beyond the several media platforms, in the sense that the story is not repeated, is not repurposed, but the story presents itself with new and relevant content in each and every media platform involved. Although we can clearly define what is cross-media, what is transmedia storytelling, actually, when we have the examples, when we have the real projects being produced, it's not that simple, because the complexity of this kind of projects that involve numerous parts spread across different media platforms, we can have things that are more complicated than just that, saying what is repeated is not transmedia storytelling, what is new is transmedia storytelling. So one classical example is Harry Potter. So Harry Potter started mainly as a cross-media project, in the sense that we had this series of books, and each book was then adapted to be a movie. But nowadays, the project expanded so much that we have much more interesting things going on inside the Harry Potter universe. So, for example, a few years ago, the author of Harry Potter came up with the Pottermore. So the Pottermore is a platform online in which she, for example, put there 100,000 new words about Harry Potter. So she had all these stories and other information about Harry Potter that she wrote but never published before. And then she made this available for the public. And this is definitely something much more connected to transmedia storytelling than to cross-media. Another example, we could think about The Lord of the Rings. So the same, we had the books were adapted into movies, but nowadays things just spread so much that we have video games, for example, with totally new perspectives and bringing new elements to the story, that it's difficult for us to say that it is still just cross-mediatic. So it's not so simple. This is still an open aspect related to the reality of multi-platform productions.
The Electric Information Age book is a phrase that was used by people in the late 1960s and early 1970s to describe an experiment that was taking place in the domain of mass media communications. And by Electric Information Age, what they were referring to was what today we would call the sort of first wave of cyberculture. As computing moved out of those research centers where it was born, largely during the World War II period, and increasingly transformed business practices, began to invade areas of society, the whole question of what its impact might be in the realm of culture of society became increasingly felt and acute, particularly as new forms of media arose and developed in importance. Particularly television. The 1960s was an era of where television really emerged as a kind of dominant media form. There was an acute sense that somehow those more traditional forms, those traditional cultural containers and vectors like forms of print culture, the magazine, the book, particularly the paperback book, books that were associated with ephemerality, not with long duration, industrial paperbacks. There was a strong sense that those genres and media would have to reinvent themselves to somehow become part of this new model of cultural communication in society that was associated with, in a kind of loose way, with cyberculture, but connected to the emergence of live media like television. And so it's in that context that the emergence of media theory itself, as embodied by Marshall McLuhan in particular, of course the 1960s are the period when McLuhan moves from being a professor at the University of Toronto, whose works are read by a rather small audience, to becoming a celebrity worldwide, a celebrity whose books, starting with Understanding Media, appear on bestseller lists. But it's really a single book that crystallizes this moment, and that's a book that illustrates the very phrase Electric Information Age book. And that book is the book, The Medium is the Massage. The Medium is the Massage, as you can see, was an industrial paperback. It was published by Bantam Books in 1967. And The Medium is the Massage was an attempt to literally take McLuhan's thought, the kind of thinking about these emerging currents within society and culture that were theorized in Understanding Media, and to translate them into a new kind of object, a kind of multimedia book that would respond to the challenge, the competition, if you like, of live media. And The Medium is the Massage was not a book that McLuhan wrote. It was, even though you see his name as author next to another name, in reality, Medium is the Massage was a remix of McLuhan's thought in a new kind of graphic, typographic collage, montage style, largely created by Quentin Fiore, who's listed as the co-author here, a graphic artist. But alongside Quentin Fiore, somebody who's also listed on the title page, Jerome Agel, listed here as the coordinator of the book. And Agel and Fiore together really tried to invent a new kind of medium of communications, a kind of television era book, a book that makes argument through the crisscrossing of images and text, that tries to experiment with what a paperback book might look like, that has the sort of feeling of liveness almost, being almost like a kind of television representation of the thought of a major theorist, thinker of the period. And Marshall McLuhan largely played a kind of secondary role in the genesis of the project. But this was the era in which McLuhan was actually translating his own thought into television appearances, consulting work with businesses, in a whole range of domains. I'm interested in this phenomenon because I think it represents the beginning of a kind of crisis, you might say, in traditional print culture, that the arrival of the second cyberculture, of the kind of transformations that the personal computing revolution and its the emergence of increasingly either hybrid forms of publishing between the digital and the print model, but also, of course, the whole world of experimentation with ebooks, with electronic publishing, with new models of disseminating knowledge, of representing knowledge. And for me, the electronic information age book is a kind of moment in the genesis, the kind of evolutionary narrative that takes us from the first cyberculture to the second cyberculture, to the cyberculture that informs our own era, in a sense. So the book itself, the object this is a collaboration with a graphic designer, just like the McLuhan book has Quentin Fiore as the co-author. The Electric Information Age book, which is this book that my colleague, my collaborator Adam Michaels and I published in 2012, published, is itself a kind of book whose message, whose content and whose form, if you like, are deeply intertwined. Just as Fiore and Agel tried to translate McLuhan's message into a message that, however complex, speaks to an audience that's a hybrid audience, an audience that thinks in terms of images, reads pages by skimming, not just by linear, close kinds of forms of reading. It's a book that plays with the conventions of the book itself. You can see here, I just passed by a page where you can see the thumbs of the reader inserting themselves into the page. Similarly, Adam and I produced a scholarly book, but it's a scholarly book that uses the same visual conventions in a kind of pastiche, kind of playful way, simply as an attempt to build a bridge between the conversation about the future of communications, particularly print-based communications, that was taking place in the late 1960s, and the present of that conversation. And it's a very lively conversation. So what should a book look like in a world where digitally native forms of knowledge are increasingly the norm? That's the question that, in a sense, we wanted to engage in through the creation not only of a scholarly project that excavates this otherwise largely forgotten moment of experimentation with a genre of paperbacks that had a successful life during the late 60s and early 70s, but mostly died out in the 1970s. By the middle of the 1970s, they died out. We excavate that historical moment, but we excavate it with an eye towards the present and the future. And it's in that context that the Electric Information Age book, our book, is part of a larger conversation, not only among designers and scholars in fields like my own who are interested in producing experimental books and rethinking what a book looks like in the present, but also in experimenting with crossovers between media. So, for instance, this book is paired with a series of other experiments we've done. We've published a series of pamphlets that are supplements to the Electric Information Age book. We have actually carried out continued an experiment that was already part of the Medium is the Massage, which is we actually produced a live stage version, which is in the form also of a vinyl record, a limited editional vinyl record that is a kind of, it's not really a remix, but it's a performed version of the argument of the book that plays with the fact that McLuhan, Agel, and Fiore had done an album version of the original Medium is the Massage, in part because they had this feeling that somehow the boundary line between the book as an artifact and other media was now increasingly porous, that it was impossible to stop a book sort of at the boundary lines of its cover, and that sound, even live sound media, were somehow part of the larger picture of how knowledge was being increasingly conveyed in contemporary society. So it's that full sort of spectrum of possibilities that interested us both in terms of the historical project, but also this present kind of challenge, which is a challenge that I'd before defined in terms of knowledge design. What does knowledge look like in the 21st century? What forms should it take? What's the relationship between traditional print-based or textual forms of argumentation and other modes of argumentation? The use of visualizations that are generated through large data sets, the use of video. What if in the apparatus of an argument we include the entire archive that we work with, much like scientists publish their data sets? What does a world look like where scholarship assumes the form of curating an entire archival repository? What does a world look like where forms of argument that are scholarly, that are research-based, archivally based, manifest themselves in a kind of process where design elements are a key feature of that act of communication, going far beyond textual modes of argumentation? Those are the kinds of questions that interested me, particularly in this experiment. So the books have never been static. The history of books, really going back to Gutenberg, but forward through the 1960s and 70s to the present, has always been one of constant reinvention. And so the arrival of new media, in the case of the 50s and 60s television, or in the case of the 1990s and 2000s, digital media, is always producing a kind of perturbation, a kind of disturbance vis-a-vis print. And that disturbance produces new forms. It engenders innovation. And I think in the 60s and 70s, the Electric Information Age book was an example of one of those perturbations, one of those disturbances. And it's certainly one that begins to prefigure some of the features of the media regime that begins to, I think, become almost dominant in the 1990s and certainly into our own era, where the meshing of print and, for instance, text and image has become such a kind of systematic feature of different communications models, particularly the magazine, for instance, if we take that as an example. So you could say that people were dreaming of a kind of what Alan Kay would call a dynabook, a kind of electrical book, already when they were experimenting with this kind of montage, collage-based form of televisual paperbacks in the late 60s and early 70s. And that's one of the reasons I'm interested in this phenomenon, clearly. And I think the whole question of what is an electronic book is very much an open question today. Most e-publishing is of very little design interest to me. I think it essentially is backward-looking. But of course, the real potential of tablets or of other kinds of devices as readers, the real potential of the e-book to become something very different with respect to what we understand as a book, a printed book. That's, I think, still very much a future project. There's some very rich experimentation going on among designers with trying to really think through what an e-book could be, books that adapt themselves to where you're reading them, what angle you're reading them at, to your eyesight, to a whole series of user-initiated constraints or possibilities. That seems to me a very rich area for future development. But I think we're really at the infancy of the ebook. I've been particularly interested in a kind of perverse way almost in the whole question of the redesign of paper books, almost more than ebooks, even though I've, in my own work, experimented with hybrid models. For instance, books that are printed books that expand out into a web repository that's a kind of a part of the book, maybe with some overlap between the two elements. I've also experimented with divergent scenarios where the book is a separate object, but it has this sort of world that's where the content doesn't overlap, that's supported on a website. I've also experimented with books that have QR codes or barcodes that use sort of transfer devices, mediating devices like smartphones or tablets. I think the whole question of what those genres are going to look like is an open question.
We've assumed that things have to be ordered, both for a good reason and a bad reason. And the good reason is that we need to find things, and to do that you need a principle of organization that you know and you can figure out where to look for stuff. That, of course, makes total sense. The bad reason is that we have assumed that things really fit into an order of the universe. And traditionally in the West, and it's only been in the past 100 years that this has weakened its grip on us at all, but for 2,400 years, we've assumed that to know what something is to know its place in the order of the universe, a perfect order in which everything has a place and only one place and one right place. That is not a helpful assumption. We got to that because when you are organizing physical objects, whether it's books in a library or it's spices in the kitchen, you have to make a decision about a single principle of organization. So if you want to organize your books alphabetically, but your spouse wants to do it by topic, only one of you can win. You cannot do both. If you want to organize your spices by area of the world, then your spouse wants to do it by is it a hot spice? Is it a savory spice? Only one of you can win, and so we have these arguments. In the digital world, that goes away because we can have multiple orders of organization at the same time. And our notion that things have a proper place, and to say what something is to say what its place in the world is, turns out to be an artifact of the limitations of the way we organize physical things. So I find it helpful to think about there being three orders of organization. And in the first order of organization, you organize the things themselves, the books on the shelf or spices on the rack. In the second order, it's important enough to you, and you have enough items, that you create a physically independent set of metadata. The classic example are catalog cards for a library, which some of us remember, most of us won't. Paper cards, each one representing a book. And if you do that, you can now have 3 cards for every book. So you have 3 principles of organization. And so people can look up the book by author alphabetically, they can look it up by subject alphabetically, they can look it up by title alphabetically. And that's 3 orders put on top. But in order to do that for the second order of organization, you have to reduce the amount of information to, in the case of a book, to what fits on a single card. Because otherwise you would have a card catalog that's as big as the library, and that's not helpful. And so we've thrown out all sorts of information. We've made very good decisions. I work in a library, so we've made very good decisions about what goes on that card. Really wise decisions, but we've had to throw out most of the information about the books, including all of the text. I mean, that just doesn't fit on the card. So we've paid a very serious price for this. So that's the second order of organization. And then you can digitize that as well, as libraries did in the 70s. They took their paper card catalogs and turned them into electronic catalogs, which made it easier to search. In the third order, everything is digital. It's not that you have the physical object and the physical representation, rather everything is physical. Everything is digital. The book is a digital object, the information about it is digital, and it all gets smushed together. This, I think, has led to a pretty fundamental change in how we think about metadata, which is information about information. So in the information age, back when we were we had mainframes and the like, it seemed there was a very clear distinction between the data and the metadata. So the data would be for a personnel record, would be the person's name and address and when she started and so forth. The metadata would be the information that labels those columns. When you looked up a book in the library, you looked up the metadata. You looked up the author's name, that was metadata, and would get you to the book. That's how the second order works. But now that everything is becoming digital, that's an overstatement, but it's pretty much true. Everything's becoming digital. The distinction between metadata and data really doesn't hold up anymore. So now if you go to Google Books, for example, you can look up metadata in the standard way. But if you know the author's name and you want to find out what the book was, you type in the author's name and you get the book back. You don't just get the metadata back, by the way. You get back the book as long as it's licenses work. So let's say it's Moby Dick, which is in the public domain. You'll get back the entire text. But if you remember a little bit of the text, like the opening line, "Call me Ishmael," and you can't remember what book it's in, you type that into a search engine, and that becomes the metadata. And you'll get back the author's name and the entire text. In fact, you'll get back for everything. You'll get back, because it's, it's a search engine, you'll get back the text, you'll get back a map to Herman Melville's house, you'll get his social network, who he hung out with, you'll get the maps to their houses in the Berkshires, you'll get back the biology of the whale, you'll get back the ecology of the whale, you'll get back Al Gore, you will get back everything. So it turns out the distinction between metadata and data is not this hard-coded thing as it was in the second order. The distinction is simply that metadata is the thing that you know, and data is what you're looking for. And if you know the author's name, then that's the metadata. And if you know the quote, then that's the metadata. And as a result, everything is metadata, which is really wonderful news, because we use metadata in the first place to pry up knowledge, to find something that we don't yet know. And if everything is metadata and everything's connected, then we just got much, much smarter. Everything can find everything else. That does, however, create an enormous mess, a disorder. And that's a terrible problem in the physical world. So you take all the books in the library and you dump them off the shelves, and somebody comes in and says, I'd like to find Herman Melville, and you're the librarian, you're going to say, I'm sorry, it's going to take us a couple of years just to sort through. I mean, a mess is a terrible thing in the physical world. But it's a wonderful thing in the digital world, because the messiness of digital objects is caused by their vast linkedness. It's those so many links among so many things. We don't have to decide ahead of time what links matter. This has always been a problem when we've ordered and organized in the old ways. So we had to make a decision about what was the really important thing about an object. Is it its title? Is it the author's name? Is it the country? Is it the licensing? And we make good choices, but to do so we have to anticipate what our users are going to be interested in and how they're going to think about things. Nobody can do that. We are very squirrely species. It's really hard to predict what we're going to be interested in, what's going to matter to us. And the little thing that doesn't matter to you may turn out to have tremendous significance to me. We also don't know what history is going to do. So you may remember Sarah Palin, who ran for vice president in 2008, who was pretty much a disaster. She was an unknown politician. And as a result, if you were the person who was in charge of curating the collection of newspapers over the 1990s, you would never, ever, ever have preserved the meeting notes for the library committee in the little town in Alaska that she came from. You could not anticipate that Sarah Palin, who was involved apparently in some bad stuff in the library, that this would matter, that this would ever matter. You cannot predict history. You cannot predict what's going to matter to people. But we've had to predict because we couldn't contain everything, because we didn't have enough space, and we'd have to decide what are the 10 different fields we're going to put on the library card. But we can't know what's going to matter. We just can't. I think it's John C. Lee Brown who gives the example of a book that smells like vinegar. And it turns out that indicates that the book was in a library during the age of cholera, where vinegar was thought to disinfect. I probably have that entirely wrong. Anything factual I get wrong immediately. Nobody would have predicted that that's interesting. Now we don't have to make those decisions. We can enable this enormous mess, and every link that somebody finds, most of them are good and interesting, some of them are completely personal and who cares, and some of them are just wrong. Every link now, every relationship is now accessible. That is a gigantic mess, but it's also a huge increase in the available meaning of things. So rather than having to strip things down to an essential set of properties, an essential set of metadata so that we can organize and find them, we can now be hugely inclusive. We can include everything in a big mess, allow more and more messiness to emerge, because every time somebody does a sort of local curation, they find 5 things that are interesting to them, you can reabsorb that fact back into the mess, and that mess gets richer and richer and richer. But it does mean that we have to provide tools for filtering, not on the way in, where the curator, the editor, the publisher decides what's important, but tools for filtering on the way out, so that the people who are using this mess can look at it and find what's interesting and important to them, much of which will be unpredictable. But finding what is interesting and unpredictable is at the core of innovation and understanding. And so this gigantic mess that we're enabling, this digital mess, this digital disorder, turns out, I think, to be both confusing and enriching. There are many examples of how we're doing this. And one of my favorite examples is the rise of tagging. So in the middle 2000s, tagging became quite popular and dominant, and it's sort of slipped from consciousness, but it's done so in a way that we're just not as aware of it, but it's become part of what we do. So for example, the new Apple operating system, Mavericks, has expanded the ability to use tags. So a tag is a little bit of text, a word or phrase that a user applies to some object. It might be a document on your computer, or it might be some post on the web or a scientific article that says what you think it's about in a way that you'll remember, so that you can find it again, and you can find all the items that have that same tag. So at Flickr, the photo sharing site, you tag things with whatever tags you want, and there's communal tagging. People can tag your photos whatever they want, because they may find something interesting in your photo that you didn't think was interesting. This is very, very different from the controlled vocabulary approach that has been typical for a long time, where a set of experts, and they are genuine experts, this is very difficult art, come up with a set of terms that they think are perfectly clear and unambiguous and will apply to everything in the domain. And you don't want to have more than one way of referring to things, because if you refer to them, let's say it's eBay, and you refer to them as laptops, as portables, and as, I don't know, people won't find. If they look for one term, they won't find the others. So in the traditional approach, you come up with a controlled vocabulary that covers the entire domain and does so in an unambiguous way. And there's great value to that. But it means that if you have a different way of thinking about the world, it won't work for you. There's also always politics involved in this. So one of the famous examples is photo collections from the 1950s had a controlled vocabulary. These are people who are selling stock photos or news photos. And they would use a controlled vocabulary to say that this is a picture of a woman. So you could search for these things. She's outside. And they had very few for women in professions. They had the tag housewife, which is no longer really a helpful way of thinking about women in our culture. There are inevitably controlled vocabularies express the way that we are thinking at the time, and thus contain things that we're embarrassed about later and are unhelpful to us later. So tagging takes a very different approach, which says we will not control the vocabulary, we will allow people to apply their own. Often it will be mysterious. If you look at somebody else's tag, you may not be able to figure out why it was tagged that way. It may be highly ambiguous. I may say SF, meaning this is a photo of San Francisco, and you may say SF because to you it's Sally Fields, or it's Santa Frisco, Santa Fernando. And you can't tell just by looking at those two letters. So it's way more messy and complex, but it also is a far more accurate expression of how we think, how we, the users, think about the world. It's bottom up instead of top down. It's rich instead of narrowed. And it's incredibly messy as opposed to being highly ordered and unambiguous. But the bottom up expresses something that the top down misses, which is the richness of the connections and the messiness of the meanings that we as a world share. The internet is changing the nature of knowledge. Knowledge in the West has had a number of characteristics right from the beginning of the invention of knowledge in ancient Greece as justified true belief, which is Plato's way of talking about it. So knowledge has been settled. If people are still disagreeing about whether or not something is knowledge, and we say, well, we don't know yet. Right from the beginning, knowledge has been only the sets of beliefs that make it through the tests of knowledge. So it's always been a reduction. Among all the beliefs, only some are knowledge. We've assumed that knowledge is orderly and in fact beautiful, that it all goes together really, really nicely. And despite what we tend to think, knowledge has been a series of stopping points, because we've known that the world is way, way larger than our capacity to know it. And so we came up with a really clever strategy for dealing with that, which is when we know something, when we've settled on some piece of knowledge, we tuck it away and we count it as known so that we can move on. So if I were curious about what the atomic weight of carbon is, I look it up, I get the answer, I move on. I don't have to reprove what the atomic weight of carbon is. And if I don't trust the source can tell me that it has a degree from Oxford, if it's a person, if it's an expert, or it can tell me that it was published by a University of Oxford. And so we have a secondary set of stopping points for inquiry, which is a credentialing system that lets knowledge go forward. And it's been incredibly productive for us. But all of these are a response to the most basic fact, which is our brains are really, really small and the world is really, really big. And a little brain trying to understand the world just can't. It is absolutely not an accident that those properties of knowledge are all also properties of the medium of knowledge, which has been paper and books and libraries. So just as knowledge is the result of filtering, also so is publishing. So is what makes it into a library. Very few books, in terms of a percentage, make it into a typical library. Just as knowledge has been settled, well, that's how paper works. Once you've published it, you can't take the words back. So the ink settles into the paper, and you cannot change them. And so knowledge has taken on this property as well. Knowledge is orderly. Well, so are books and how we write them. We structure them very carefully, and so are libraries and how we organize them. And written books are stopping points. I mean, they're wonderful, we all like them, but they are stopping points. The author knows that you cannot easily go from the book back to the library to follow a link, to look something up. And so the author's job is to get everything the reader needs within the covers. And knowledge has taken on that property as well. It is what fits between covers or fits within a discipline. All of these properties of knowledge are properties of the medium of knowledge, but now that knowledge has a new medium, the internet, then we can expect that knowledge will take on properties of the internet as well. And I think we can already see that happening. So if you're interested in some topic, whether it's the faster than light neutrino data that came out of CERN, of the largest physics experiment in the world in 2011, or if you are interested in who actually wrote Shakespeare's works and is there new evidence and the like, you will, these days, very, very likely, you'll go out on the web. And there you will find very active debates. You'll find, in fact, the web. People who are linking to one another. They're arguing, they're disagreeing, or they're supporting, or they're elaborating. There are no constraints on who gets to do this. So in both of these cases, both Shakespeare and faster than light neutrino, you'll find the world's great scholars, but you'll also find people who are very talented amateurs and people who are not very talented amateurs, and high school students and reporters and people who have a casual interest. You'll find every sort of person, and together they're contributing, they're making this web, which is held together by a shared interest, even though it only has value because there's disagreement among the people about the nature of the truth of the issue. If everybody were saying the same thing, it would be settled and done. It wouldn't be a web. In fact, it would be negative. If everybody's saying the same thing, people reinforce their beliefs. So what gives these webs, which emerge naturally, these webs of knowledge value, is the fact that they contain difference and disagreement. Very unsettled. Now, as things become settled, we can also look them up very easily. But the life of knowledge, we can now see it and participate in it in a way that we couldn't before. That used to be hidden from us. So when Britannica was creating Encyclopedia Britannica, the great English language encyclopedia, when they were writing their articles, they carefully hid from public view the arguments between the editors and the authors about what should be in and what to say. Whereas at Wikipedia, there's always a discussion page where the people who are participating in writing the main page explain and defend their point of view. So that web of knowledge that is now completely public and is incredibly rich. There are dangers, of course. It means that people who don't have credentials can sound just as smart and knowledgeable as people who do. There is some hope that we, over time, sort things through. We come up with sources that we rely upon and the like. I think most of us would say that the net has in fact made us smarter. Although when we look out across the world, many of us, not so much me, but many of us say, no, the internet's making us stupid. It's making everybody stupid but us. There are certainly prices to pay for this. Likewise for filtering. So knowledge used to be filtered for us. But filtering, which still happens, of course, but filtering is different on the internet. So it used to be that when you were, let's say, a book publisher, you would filter out the manuscripts that weren't worth publishing. And if somebody was interested in one of those manuscripts, the chances are very good that person couldn't find it. They're gone. You just can't find them. All the manuscripts submitted to academic publications, scientific, good science in many cases, is just not important enough to make it in. They're simply gone. So we still filter on the internet. We have to because it's so overwhelming. But we do it differently. So if I am a blogger and I am posting the top 10 genomics articles of the week, top 10 genomic posts of the week, I pick them and I list them, so I've done the filtering, and I've put in links, of course. All the ones that I didn't pick that week are still fully available. Find them in a Google search, somebody will pass it around through Twitter or email or whatever, they're all still there. I have not filtered anything out. I've only filtered things forward. Really what I've done is made it so that those 10 that I've picked are only one click away. I've shortened the number of clicks that it takes to get to them for people who come across my blog. And so filtering now is additive, it's not reductive. Because the fact that I filtered that is itself an interesting piece of information, and that other people filtered it differently. Those acts of curation add their own information, and all the material is still there. And so the scale gets huge. We don't have to reduce to know, we can now include. You see the same sort of thing at a site like Stack Overflow, which is a hugely popular site among software developers, where you can pose a question and somebody will answer, and then frequently somebody else will fix the answer or disagree or give a better way of doing it and explain why. And at the end of this discussion, you have a set of code that's completely usable, and you can just copy and paste. But you've also now seen the discussion about how this got developed. This, again, the publicness of this is tremendously important. And I think we see two things at sites like Stack Overflow, and there are many, many such sites. The first is the power of iteration at scale. That is, making small changes when you have millions of people, and in fact billions of people now connected on the internet, and millions of people attending to sites like Stack Overflow. You can see this at Wikipedia, you can see this at Reddit, you can see it on lots of sites. So lots of people making small changes can build things that we could not have imagined because our brains are not built for thinking about scale. We have very local brains, and you have people from around the world who are collaboratively building a piece of code. It's pretty spectacular, and it was unpredictable that this would work, but it does. Iteration at scale. And the second thing that we see at these sites where knowledge is being built. So I think we're seeing a change in an ethos about knowledge, not among everybody, but among many on the internet, that learning in private is fine, but you're the only one who's improved. When, without any extra effort at a site like Stack Overflow, you can learn in public, and anybody else who comes along can learn from you. So if you go to Stack Overflow with a question, the chances are extremely small that you are the first person to have asked that question. It's been answered in public, you can learn from it. This is hugely efficient, and it also enables knowledge to get very, very big. So we're changing our basic strategy on the internet in a way that makes sense for the internet, from a strategy of reducing to fit our very small capacity for libraries and what gets to the economics of publishing. These are all very narrow gates to pass through, to understanding knowledge in a much more capacious way, in a scaled way, just as the internet is scaled. There is no central filter. There are many, many, many filters. We all filter along the way, and is messy and full of disagreement. Those are now becoming properties of knowledge, and I think that represents a fundamental new strategy for us. And overall, I think this is quite wonderful. This is now the greatest time in the world's history to be somebody who cares about knowledge. It's also the greatest time, however, to be a complete idiot, because you can find what it is you want to believe and find lots of people who agree with that and continue to believe it. And this is a really important issue. And I don't know how it will be resolved, because there is no set way this is going to be resolved. We have to work it out, and it may vary by locality and by type of person. I really don't know. We do seem to be finding our way in some areas where we find a reliable source, And a very traditional model. We find a reliable source, an authority, and we trust them. And we trust them because of their credentials. If it's the Oxford chemistry department, well, probably pretty good. If it's MIT on software design, probably pretty reliable. Very traditional way, but that makes sense. We don't want to throw out what works traditionally. But we also now trust sources that we don't even know the pedigree. So in English, there's a site called Snopes.com, which is a wonderful site for looking up urban myths. It's going around the internet that, I don't know, there's a virus, or one of the famous ones is that there are satanic symbols on Procter & Gamble products. And you can look it up in Snopes, and Snopes has a very good reputation for being accurate, even though I can't tell you who Snopes is or who does it. And maybe over time that will become a corrupted source, but right now. So we are finding our way through it. The real problem, I think, the real issue for us is that we still want knowledge to be fixed and independent of us. We want to think that there is something called knowledge which gets put into containers like books and is there forever, and we know it's true. It's knowledge, it doesn't change. And it turns out the world is much more postmodern than we may have wanted, but it is, and the internet has shown that knowledge is no longer simply a content. The interesting knowledge is that which is in play, in discussion, and now publicly and heavily linked together as a web that we can explore.
If you walk into school classrooms today, they're starting to look a lot different than they did, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. You see a lot more technology in the classrooms, kids using laptops or tablets. But even though they look somewhat different with these new technologies, a lot of times the whole approach to education hasn't changed very much. And I think that's a real problem. They were holding on to old ways of teaching and learning, even though we're starting to be surrounded by these new technologies. To me, what's really important is we have to rethink our approaches to learning and education to fit with the new possibilities of the digital age. With new technologies, they provide us with an opportunity to rethink what we learn, how we learn, where we learn, when we learn, who we learn with. But too often, people aren't taking advantage of the possibilities of the new technology. Of course, we see some of the new possibilities, that you see that computers are delivering more information to us than ever before. We have access to more information. But I worry that it's too information-centric a view of education. It's all about delivering information or getting access to information. And in my mind, that's not the way to really transform education for a new age. That education too often has been about an expert delivering information to a learner. And what too often we're doing with new technologies is that we're taking technology delivering information to the learner. We're still holding on to a transmission or delivery model of learning, as if learning is about delivering information from one person to another or from one technology to a person. And I don't think that that's the most productive way of learning, especially in today's society. New technologies do hold the opportunity for very different approaches for education. For example, we can treat the technology not as a way to deliver and access information, but as a material for building and creating things in the world. I mean, this goes back to the theories of Jean Piaget, the great psychologist, epistemologist, who talked about learning as an effort of active construction of new knowledge, that we don't get knowledge delivered to us from the outside, but we're constantly actively constructing knowledge from our interactions in the world. So what we want to do is build on those theories from Piaget, but now we have new experiences in the world, new things that we can interact with, create with, that allows us to build up knowledge in new ways from before. This is something that I learned from my mentor, Seymour Papert, who was a student of Piaget and then came to MIT and brought Piaget's theories into the digital age. Seymour started seeing technology as a way to let people design and create new things, which will let them explore new ideas. Let me give an example of one way that I've done this in my research. So I developed a programming language called Star Logo that allows people to write simple rules for lots of little objects and then see the general behaviors that emerge from all the interactions. For example, you could write simple rules for each individual bird, and then through their interactions, you see how a flocking behavior can emerge from the interactions. Or write simple behaviors for cars on a road and see when traffic jams form. Now, in the past, to study these types of scientific phenomena, bird flocking or traffic jam formation, you needed to have advanced mathematical background. You would solve partial differential equations to understand it. But now, people without that sophisticated mathematical training can, with the new technology, write simple rules and simulate the behavior and gain a deep understanding of things like emergent phenomena and decentralized systems. Things that typically weren't studied until graduate courses can now be brought down to middle school students starting to explore these ideas. We've taken the same approach when we worked with the Lego toy company, and we developed a new robotics construction kit called Lego Mindstorms. And this allows even young children to build robotic devices and write programs for how they should behave. As children do this, they start exploring ideas about feedback and control. Again, engineering ideas that typically weren't taught until much later. Young children, through their explorations by building and programming robots, can start to get an understanding of these important scientific and engineering ideas. So technology, if used in the right way, really has an opportunity to change what it is that we can learn. That allows, even without advanced mathematical background, to let children, through building simulations or building robots, to learn advanced mathematical and scientific ideas. Similarly, technology can change how we learn. It's not just about delivering information, but learning through experimentation and exploration. We often use the term tinkering, that we allow that people can learn by experimenting, trying things out, see what works. Oftentimes with technology, it allows you to create something and immediately see whether it works or not, and then make adjustments. So it's not necessarily the case anymore that you have to come up with an entire plan and then execute it. With technology, you can experiment, build a quick prototype, try it out, see what works or doesn't work, adjust your prototype. So this idea of rapid prototyping, which is very important in the engineering world, is also a learning approach. That learning can also come through rapid prototyping of trying new things, using technology to quickly take the ideas in your mind, try it out in the world, see if it works, and then that helps you develop new ideas. So it's this constant spiral between building ideas in your head and then creating things in the world to try them out, and that gives you new ideas. This is an idea that, again, Seymour Papert referred to as constructionism. That constructionism is the idea that by constructing things in the world is the best way to construct ideas in your mind. So we're always, and we see that of course, this could be done without new technologies, but new technologies provide many new ways that we can build in the world. That it expands the range of things that we can design, and therefore it expands the range of things that we can learn. At the same time that we can rethink what we learn and how we learn, we can also rethink where we learn and when we learn. It doesn't just have to be in the school, between 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. With technology, we can be learning all the time, be able to create things on our own. It doesn't have to be in a specific setting. We can try it in an after-school setting or in a home setting, in the evening, during the summer, during the winter. It breaks down the boundaries of when it is and where it is that people are learning, and also with whom they're learning. Too often we think of learning happening in a classroom among people of the same age and roughly the same abilities. But in fact, a lot of the best learning happens when you connect people with different backgrounds and different experiences. And again, technology can facilitate that by creating new online learning networks where people of different ages are working together and learning from one another. People with less expertise can learn from people with greater expertise, But people with greater expertise also learn by explaining their ideas to others. This is something that we've seen in the online programming community that we've developed around our Scratch software. There's people of all different ages creating projects and learning with and from one another. So this idea of peer-to-peer learning among people of different ages is something that is enhanced and facilitated by new technologies. So I think if we think of technologies in the right way, but that's a big if. This will not happen automatically. It's only if we think of them in the right way, we really can break out of old, outmoded approaches to learning to move away from the transmission, delivery model of learning to a new model of learning where people are constantly learning by creating models, building things, exploring new ideas in collaboration with one another. I think new technologies provide us with an opportunity to rethink the structure of schools. If it were up to me, I'd break down many of the boundaries of schools. Schools put up lots of boundaries. They put boundaries between different disciplines. There's math class and science class and English class. But the best learning happens when people work on projects. Technology lets people work on advanced projects that cut across those boundaries. Technology can also break down the boundaries between ages. A school could have younger students working with older students and learning with and from one another. They could also break down the boundaries between inside of school and outside of school, having experts from the community communicating with young people who are in the classroom. We don't have to see the classroom as sort of an isolated world. It can be connected to the world. So that's another boundary that can be broken down. So I think we can use new technology to break down the boundaries between disciplines, boundaries between ages, boundaries between in school and outside of school, to open up new opportunities for learning. I think it's always important to remember that technologies can be used in many different ways. Some can really enhance learning and open up new learning opportunities. Some ways of using technology can constrain us to very traditional ways of learning. So for me, it's not so much about what particular device you're using, but more the way that you're using it. For me, the best way to think about the role of technology is whether the child is in control of the technology or not. If the child is using the technology to design, create, experiment, explore, that's a good use of the technology. If the technology is only being used to deliver information, or the child is just interacting and pointing and clicking and browsing, that's not as good use of the technology. Technologies will continue to evolve. The technologies of 20 years from now will be very different than today. But I think this general rule is the same. We should always look to how technologies can be used for experimenting, exploring, expressing ourselves, whether it's creating a simulation on the screen or using a 3D printer to create a new physical object. There are many different ways of using technology. We should always be looking how technology can be used to enhance the way people experiment, explore, and express themselves.
So the initial question is, why call something digital anthropology in the first place? And people probably wouldn't associate the discipline of anthropology with the studies of the digital. But if you think about it, anthropology was always a subject dedicated to the study of peoples around the world, and whatever the peoples around the world do, therefore we want to be studying it. So for us, in a way, it's a fairly obvious advance that we simply acknowledge that there have been developments in the digital field in so many different ways. I'm going to be talking particularly about work on social media and digital communications. But in our program on digital anthropology, we also have courses on, for example, data or infrastructure or the digitalization of museum archives. And it's hard to think of anything that isn't actually affected by the process of digitalization. So for us, it's natural progression of anthropology. We follow what happens in the world. If the world goes digital, we go digital. But I do think there's an additional point here, because in contemporary anthropology, we're also in some ways arguing against certain, I think, quite old assumptions, if you like, stereotypes about my discipline as a whole. because originally anthropology was associated with the study of tribal groups and ethnic groups, differentiated from sociology, which was seen as more the study of kind of urban societies. And in fact, actually, that's a very old image of anthropology. Today, we would say that we just study societies, whoever they may be and wherever they be. A lot of my previous projects have been, for example, in London or Trinidad, not particularly the kind of places that were associated with that very kind of original form of anthropology. So calling a program digital anthropology is perhaps quite a forceful way of making this precise point, because people associate the digital with everything that's kind of rapidly changing, nothing that's at all kind of traditional or conservative. So the idea that anthropology is now going to have a specialist arena concentrating on this area is a challenge. And one of the main things we really want to do now is demonstrate why anthropology is, in some ways, we would say, actually the very best way of understanding the digital, in as much as when we talk about the study of the digital, clearly we've got to be interested in the consequences it has on people. And that's really why this is the right domain for anthropology, because we don't have to study the technology or even understand the technology, but we really do have to understand the consequences all these changes have on populations, and we believe that in order to do that, you need the kind of approaches that we represent. I don't know whether other people have coined the phrase digital anthropology elsewhere. I guess I was the person who developed it for our particular program, and suggested it to University College London that within the Department of Anthropology we have this kind of specialist centre. But it took like 5 minutes to persuade anybody, because in a way it's a pretty obvious thing to do, and I'm glad to say that it's kind of flourishing. Now, within that program, we have many different interests, different lecturers, different courses. You can mention things like data, infrastructure, the digitalization of different domains. But my particular interest has been the development of anthropological work on new forms of digital communication. And I guess one of the reasons for that is that anthropology has always been interested in the way people socialize, the sort of networking together. In fact, when I started, they weren't even called social media, they were called social networking sites, which is a bit kind of the way anthropologists think about people. Because, like psychologists would study people as individuals, we study people as kind of social networking sites. I mean, if you think of kinship, that's kind of what it is. So we wanted to have a program that looked particularly at social media. And the other reason was that you recognize that social media is something now that has got a huge presence, that the newspapers every day make quite strange claims about the consequences of social media. They'll tell you, young people today, they don't have the proper attention span, and it's because of social media. Or young people today, they don't really understand the meaning of a proper friend, and that's because of social media. And we felt that as anthropologists, there is then a responsibility. Somebody needs to go out there and do a different kind of scholarship to actually establish what are the genuine consequences of the developments of these social media. Now, in doing that, we didn't want to compromise the way that we traditionally study. So if you like, although we're studying very new phenomena, we're using a method that has been established for a very long time. And I was fortunate in terms of funding from the European Research Council and elsewhere to be able to assemble a team of 9 people, 9 anthropologists, and we were all committed to spending 15 months each in sites all around the world. very briefly, we tended to focus on low-income sites, but we had one in northern Chile, one in Brazil, one in Trinidad. I worked in some villages north of London. We had one in the south of Italy. We have one in the deep south of India. And we actually had two in China. One is a fairly sort of traditional rural site, but the contrast was to have somebody in one of these factories. And there's been this rapid kind of change in China with 250 million people moving into the factory system. So in this case, the anthropologist simply lived inside one of these factories for 15 months to study the factory population. And anthropology, at least ideally, would like to be a comparative discipline. So the point for us was that we were very collaborative. Every month we all agreed to focus on the same topic. We compared what we were finding. And this is actually very important because I'll give you a sense of kind of what happens. The end of, let's say, a month, the person in Brazil says, oh, well, I'm trying to understand, why people post what they post on Facebook. And I see that, oh, these people, they're low income, so they're not going to post against the horrible houses, half-built brickwork that they actually live in. Of course, they're going to post by the gym or, by the swimming pool, something that shows their kind of aspirations in life. And they give this report at the end of the month. And the person from Chile turns around and says, but what are you talking about? I work in a low-income place, and here people actually are trying to forge a community around who they are. But everybody knows each other very well, and so everybody knows what's truthful about a person. You couldn't claim that you were going to the gym when everyone knows you can't afford to go to the gym. The whole point is that everybody, when posting on social media, has to be honest and unpretentious and not show these kind of aspirations, but just recognize humbly who they actually are and create the solidarity of community. So when that happens, the person in Brazil says, oh, okay, maybe what I said wasn't so straightforward. There must be a reason why Brazil is not like Chile. I now have the responsibility for looking more closely at the specific conditions of my Brazilian site. You look at your Chilean site, and let's work out why you have these differences. And I think the most important result of our project after the 15 months research was simply to say that actually there are incredible differences between these 9 sites with regard to almost any topic you like. To give the one that the journalists always kind of ask me about, they say, oh, well, everybody now takes selfies, which A means they think that they're selfish, the young people are sort of narcissistic, and B, they think, well, that's a global homogenization because everyone's taking selfies. The first point I make is no. Actually, in the schools, for example, where I worked in Britain, 5 times as many people post selfies where they put their arm around their friends to show they're all good friends together, not individualistic. So that notion of selfie or selfish doesn't work. And secondly, they post for very different reasons. So our Italian site, they actually try and be stylish in an Italian way, and they ask the hairdresser, what is the right Italian style to have before I make my selfie. Whereas in Trinidad, they're incredibly individualistic. You would never want to post a selfie that looked like somebody else. So in all of these areas, huge amounts of cultural difference. And this is a very important also counter to the way, not just social media, but the internet has been studied. Because most people studying these phenomena, they tend to focus on things like the technology and the platforms as causative. Oh, because of the nature of Twitter, it's very small, short messages, that's why people use it in this way. And we found something very different, that the same kind of communication, let's say playground banter, shifts very easily. One day it's on Facebook, then your mother comes on Facebook, so you want to get off Facebook, so you go on Twitter. But you're doing the same thing. So if the same kind of communication can travel between Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat and wherever, it can't be the technology that is causative. It means actually you have to look at these underlying cultural issues to explain why a particular platform is kind of colonized. And in the end of this, we produced, obviously, a lot of material. We have our own definition of social media. We call it scalable sociality, which means that now you've gone from having kind of the gulf between public broadcasting and private communication, as kind of broadcasting has sort of gone down to smaller sites where you broadcast to like 300 people, whereas things like messenger services moved up with things like Telegram and WhatsApp to bigger groups. So now, in a sense, you just have a range of groups. You can scale your sociality. You can have more private, less private, bigger groups, smaller groups. And this is a big change, many big changes. The way, for example, that as well as oral communication and written communication, we now have the visual. Think of something like Snapchat, where you send images of your face all day long, but it's like a conversation. So a new kind of visual communication is out there. But in terms of the impact, politics, education, etc., a lot of simplistic things said. Usually we find that social media exacerbates things that were there before. It's both bad for education, a distraction, good for education, you can find a lot of stuff out. Problems for political radicals because they can be identified by the state, good for political radicals because they can get together and use social media. So these simple statements made, far too simplistic. Obviously, a lot of material. So the one thing I should probably end on is by saying we are very committed to open access, dissemination, and making things very clear. We have 11 books coming out, all under open access with University College London Press. We have a free 5-week e-learning course, which I'm delighted to say is being translated into Russian and will soon be available in Russian. Currently it's on the FutureLearn. We have a website called Why We Post, and all our material is translated already into all the languages of all the places where we did field work, and then it's wonderful to get volunteers in places like Russia who are actually doing the translation themselves. So next, I'm getting ready to move on to a set of new questions. In the next project, for the next 5 years, we're moving to the more general ethnography of the smartphone. We're interested in particular in the development of health applications, mobile health apps. And we want to see this time whether anthropology can't actually be useful in really improving the welfare and health of populations by making these kind of new technologies more culturally and socially sensitive because of the information we've gained through carrying out these long-term ethnographies. And that is the next stage in my particular part of digital anthropology.
The humanities disciplines have been undergoing a very radical transformation over the course of the last 20 years. But it's a transformation that has deep roots in the history of the evolution of those disciplines that make up the core humanities. Starting really in the immediate post-World War II era, when mainframe computing began to have a powerful impact on other areas of research. Some early pioneers of what at the time was called computational humanities or computing in the humanities or humanistic computing or humanities informatics, it had many, many different labels, began experimenting with applying the power of mainframe computers and systems to the analysis of cultural objects, in particular literary texts. So starting in that period, we begin to see a kind of conversation emerging between the core humanities disciplines, whether initially certainly text-based, but gradually encompassing other areas of culture, and the whole area of informatics and computer science. That conversation goes on in a rather marginal way with respect to its impact on the core humanities disciplines, probably for its first 20 or 30 years, but really comes to a head, I think, in the 1980s, starting in the 1980s, but really coming to a head in the 1990s with the revolution in personal computing and the emergence of the World Wide Web as the defining public space of our time. And it's in that context that what now has come to be called digital humanities really becomes a transformational area of experimental scholarship within the humanities disciplines. I call it an area of experimentation because it isn't a new department, a new field in a conventional sense. It simply represents an umbrella under which we can group together a whole series of experimental approaches to some of the core questions that have animated the humanities disciplines from the very beginning. Questions like, what is the meaning of a given cultural object? How do different categories of objects relate to aspects of the social history of a given country or place? What is truth, beauty, meaning in a given social circumstance? How do myths or stories undergo transformations? How do ideas become symbols, objects? How do they get translated into aesthetic objects and vice versa? All these kinds of questions come to animate what has come to be called the digital humanities today. By digital_humanities, my collaborators, Anne Burdick, Joanna Drucker, Todd Presner, Peter Lunenfeld, and of course myself, made an attempt to really group together many of these very heterogeneous phenomena under a single framework, and to really talk about the deep meaning and consequences of the transformation that's taking place. What we try to look at in the book, which has been issued in an open edition online, but was the hardcover version of, was published by MIT Press, is to explore the past, present, and future of this area, to look at the different emerging genres and typologies of knowledge, the new knowledge forms that have emerged under the conditions that, as I said, started to emerge in the 1990s and have now grown, developed, matured in the course of the last 15 years. Essentially new forms of knowledge that avail themselves of the tremendous power of digital media, of computational techniques, of modes of the organization of the production of knowledge that involve, for instance, collaboration, but sometimes collaborations on a very large scale, and also that really think outside of the framework of the defining medium that has shaped scholarship in the course of the modern humanities, which is print. Print is a tremendously powerful medium. I don't believe that it's going away, but it is certainly undergoing itself a massive transformation as print moves from being the sort of normative medium of our time to being just one medium within a larger constellation of media where the norms are increasingly digitally based and print plays a supporting role. So digital_humanities, the title hints at what is the fundamental problematic of this emerging world of practices, which is how does the digital intersect the humanistic? And in what ways does that conversation transform what we understand as the human or the humanities or the human sciences, to use a more sort of French formulation, which I quite like. In fact, I prefer to the humanities, the Anglo-American form. And our argument in the book, and it's an argument that has deeply informed my own scholarly work, is that the digital humanities are not about a continuation of traditional humanistic disciplinary habits and traditions. They go beyond that. There are many aspects that involve continuity, but they are also disruptive vis-a-vis our traditional ideas about humanistic inquiry. And that disruption assumes the form of, to put it in a more positive framework, of a set of innovative possibilities. And those possibilities involve doing better work, scholarship of greater rigor, and performing scholarly work that has an audience that's vastly expanded, that goes, in other words, well beyond the confines of the distribution network of print-based knowledge. Scholarship also that cuts across the boundary line between the humanities and the natural sciences or the social sciences. In other words, scholarship that opens up the question of where the humanistic begins and ends in some new and powerful ways. And it's also scholarship, I think, in some cases, that where questions of design become integral to the scholarship itself. And maybe I'd like to say just a couple more things about that, because maybe that's the most enigmatic of the propositions that I just pronounced. But I could think of myself not so much as a historian, which is what I was trained to be, a cultural historian focused on the 13th and 14th centuries, even though I mostly work on 20th century and 21st century today. But I think of myself as a knowledge designer, principally. In other words, when we move out of the world which was the familiar world of knowledge that shaped all of our institutions of knowledge, from libraries to archives to the classroom space to universities, which was print. Print as associated, of course, with periodicals, but also particularly in the case of the humanities, associated with books, with forms of argument that assume the form of books. As we move out of that world into a world where books and print culture has to exist within an ecology that's much more complex and much richer, and where digital forms, not just digital forms, but also, for instance, dynamic media forms like video assume an increasing role in forms of argumentation and knowledge presentation. Every research question becomes a design question. All of that work that print did to essentially standardize formats, to develop conventions that were shared conventions within scholarly communities, within communities of experts, that once, in a sense, constrained the production of knowledge. All those questions are right now up for grabs. And under digital_humanities, we really try to explore that world where, in a sense, research questions are attached to design propositions, where you have to think about what your knowledge looks like at the output phase, which is to say you have to think about it at every phase, right from the beginning. And every research question becomes a design question, in a sense. So I think of the work of digital humanities as very much about designing in the complete sense of the word design. Everything from design in the professional sense, graphic design, information design, data visualizations, web design, but also at the conceptual level. How do you design? What are the genres in which you communicate or convey a complex body of information that is the outcome of a research process? So also design in the sort of deeper senses of like the genres of that knowledge is conveyed and communicated in. So by digital_humanities, what I understand and what the book tries to explore is really this sense of emerging knowledge forms where the digital transforms, inflects, reshapes our ideas about the chunks, the units that make up argument, presentation, knowledge, science, and scholarship. I think there are a number of key challenges that this sense of a kind of experimental ferment brings up. One of those challenges that is a very urgent challenge in the case of the careers of younger scholars is how do you evaluate, how do you measure these emerging genres of scholarly practice that don't look anything like the genres that we're familiar with and we know how to evaluate. And attached to that is the core challenge of evaluating collaborative scholarship. Many of the most important, most significant digital humanities projects are projects that involve large teams of people, much more like the natural sciences than like the traditional humanities. The traditional humanities have been very artisanal. They've been very focused on the individual scholar, each monk in his or her cell, basically. The digital humanities look a lot more like a laboratory. In fact, I founded in 1999 the Stanford Humanities Laboratory. When I came to Harvard, I founded MetaLab. We, in both cases, are collaborative spaces. We look a lot more like a natural science lab or an engineering lab than we do like a conventional humanities knowledge space. And we certainly combine elements of the design studio with elements of the natural science lab. For the humanities disciplines, evaluating work that is produced in this kind of way has represented a real challenge. A third challenge, I would say, has to do with sustaining projects beyond simply the moment at which they are published or they're born. Digital media change very quickly. A lot of the early history of experimentation in the space and the conversation between the digital and the humanistic has disappeared because it was built in ways that have not guaranteed its sustainability. And many of those projects were real one-offs. You know, they were kind of boutique forms of scholarship. So how do we build a community that produces knowledge that has a long duration, I think would be a fundamental question.